Hey everyone, it's me, Angela Walters, your favorite midnight quilter, and in this episode, I'm gonna make a quilt that celebrates the great outdoors from the warm coziness of my quilting room. So, let's get to it. One fun fact that you might not know about me is that I love camping and I love going to the national parks. So when Riley Blake came out with the national parks fabric, I bought them. All of them. I'm not kidding, I love it. I hate to brag, but I'm a longtime national parks passport stamp collector. No, for real. I got it right here. It's so fun. So when you go to a park, you go to the visitor center and you find a little stamp and then you can stamp it and it has the date that you went and you can buy the stickers. I just love it. And yes, I know it's for children, but I love going and collecting my stamps from different places that I've been and looking back over it and thinking, oh, I went to the Devil's Tower in August 6th of 2017. I'm not gonna tell you how far out of our way we've driven for those stamps sometimes, but you know, if you don't have a stamp, did it really ever happen? So the pattern that I've designed for this episode is gonna feature these pillow panels. Now, what I love about pillow panels is they're so versatile. You could hang them on the wall, you could make, well, pillows out of them. But I'm gonna choose 8 of them and really show them off with some fabric that's gonna have a landscape kind of look. It's so hard to narrow it down to 8 because I wanna use them all. There's so many different park panels to choose from. Like for instance, the Bryce Canyon National Park. Oh, Zion, I haven't been there yet. I think I probably will have to get over there sometime, but no, not that one. Ooh, Sequoia, I really wanna go see the big trees. I haven't seen those yet, and it's crazy because I used to live in California, but one of these days I'll get there. Maybe not that one. Yosemite, yet another place I haven't been. Ah, such big plans. Now Yellowstone, I have been to Yellowstone. That was a fun trip. Just imagine this, 13 people, 2 families in 1 RV. And shocker, we all still love each other. Oh, I like that, but I don't know. That was really a fun trip. Okay, so this is definitely on my bucket list, Glacier National Park. I think I'm gonna include that. I mean, not only do I want to go there, but I really like the colors of the panel, so I'm gonna keep that one. Ooh, and Rocky Mountain National Park, I've been there. That was a fun trip as well. And the colors were pretty. So I think I'm gonna use these 2 panels. Perfect. Now the good thing is you can get the kit on my website and you can pick which panels you want to use. So you'll have the option to customize yours. So if you're more of a Yellowstone/Bryce Canyon, you could definitely do that. Now to complement the panels, I've also picked out this stack of grunge fabrics that are really gonna pull out that landscape look in the background. It's gonna be great. So what I'm gonna do first is square up my panels and we'll talk about how to make them all the same size. First up, let's start by trimming our panels. Now I've designed the pattern so that the panels need to be trimmed to 15.5 by 20.5. But here's the kicker, not each panel is the same size as the others, but that's okay, I'm gonna show you how to handle that. First, I'm gonna separate these. Nothing too fancy here, just gonna rough cut those out. Okay, now that it's cut out, I can now trim it down to the size that it needs to be. If you don't have a ruler that's quite big enough, you can just use the lines on your mat like I'm going to do. So I'm gonna pick 2 of my lines and try to center it as best I can in between. So I'm gonna trim up the sides and then turn it and trim up the ends. Now if the idea of just cutting into it makes you a little bit nervous, you could go ahead and mark out those lines beforehand and make sure you like the placement before you use your rotary cutter. So the width is now trimmed to the 15.5 inches, but when it comes to the length, here's where we start getting a little interesting. I want it to be 20.5 inches long, but if I measure that out, it'll fit and it will work, but I'm gonna have a little bit of this brown on the top and I don't really want that. So what I'm gonna do instead is taking this into effect, I have about 3/4 inch on each side, I'm gonna go ahead and trim that and then add pieces to make it bigger. Now if that seems like too much to think about, don't worry, I've included instructions on how to do that in the pattern. Basically, I don't want the dark fabric on the top and bottom, so I'm gonna trim it smaller and add background fabric to make it bigger. Since I have about 3/4 inch on the sides, I'm gonna trim it about 3/4 of an inch away from the center panel. Of course, if you don't mind that darker fabric in the background, it's all right. You can just go ahead and make it 20.5. So now it's ready to be set aside. I'm not gonna go ahead and add the background fabric yet because depending on its placement in the quilt, I'm gonna use different fabric. That might not make sense yet, but when we see the whole quilt come together, you'll finally see what I'm talking about. I'm gonna trim up a couple more of these and then we'll start cutting up the grunge fabrics. So once my panels are all cut, it's time to start cutting up the grunge fabrics. Now I'm sure you can see the inspiration behind this color selection. I love how it looks like it's the trees and the greenery and the beautiful sky. It's gonna look stunning. So I'm gonna cut these up into the pieces and then we'll finally get to make our quilts. So I'm going to cut the fabric into strips and then subcut the strips into rectangles. And some of these will go together to make half rectangle triangles. It's a really neat technique that's going to look cool on the quilt. So I'm going to finish cutting this up and then we'll see how the first blocks come together. So the good news is this quilt is not difficult to piece. The bad news is you definitely want to stay organized and know what pieces are going where. So I've gathered all the fabrics that go in the top section. I have my fabrics that look like the sky and clouds and mountains. I also have the 3 panels that I've decided that I want in the top section. And so what I'm going to do first, before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and make them the size they need to be. If you remember, they weren't quite long enough, so I have strips of the background fabric that I'm going to sew to the top. Then once I have it sewed to the top, then I can trim it to its 20.5. And this is going to really make them kind of pop off of that background without having that distracting dark frame around it. So I'm just going to sew this on real quick. It's going to look just like that. Beautiful. For the rest of this section and the rest of the quilt, we're going to be making those half rectangle triangles. They're not difficult, but you really have to pay attention to the arrangement of it. So let me grab the first 2 rectangles that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to be using these fabrics to make my half rectangle triangles. It's really hard to remember how to say that. I keep wanting to say half square triangles, but it's not a square, it's a rectangle. So I have my 4 rectangles. Now I'm going to cut them in half diagonally once, and the direction of the cut will determine the arrangement of that triangle. So one of each color I'm going to cut diagonally one way, and the other one I'm going to cut the opposite direction. Now, even though I have all of these triangles, I'm not going to actually use them all. These 2 are extras, and so I'm going to put them aside. I'm not going to need those. Because even though they look like they're reversible, they're not. I need 1 of each direction. Now you might be wondering, why can't I just use 2 from the same rectangle? Well, this is the shape that I would have if that's what I'm doing. So it looks like it should be reversible, but it's not. So you want to pay very close attention to the pieces that you have. So I have my 2 blues, and then I'm going to match them up with my 2 grays. Now I will be using these again in just a moment, so I'm going to set them aside, make sure I don't lose them or get them mixed up with the extra pile. And then we're going to sew them together to make our first half rectangle triangle. Now to sew together our block, we're going to simply place them right sides together along that long edge. And if some of the points extend past, it's going to be fine. Don't worry about that. We're going to sew our 1/4 inch seam along that. Now I've made this block big enough so we can trim it down to size. So that's going to give us a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to the piecing. So I'm going to go over to my machine and sew that 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to go ahead and do the other one, a quick press, and then we'll trim them up. I'm going to trim these rectangles down to 4.5 by 6.5. And so what I have to be really aware of is where this line is getting trimmed, because I want to have that beautiful point when they sew together. So I have my 6.5 inch ruler, and I'm going to place it on top. And what I'm looking for is a point that's 1/4 inch inside the corner. Right, so that's where I want my line to dissect it so that I can get that pretty point. So when I find that point right there, and we can see where that seam is hitting that point right there, where these 2 lines, right, 1/4 inch up and 1/4 inch in. So I've got that there, and then I'm going to come over to my top. If I want it to be 4.5 inches, I'm going to look to 1/4 inch inside. So I'm kind of looking to this mark right here and positioning both of those on that seam. So as you can tell, I'm going to kind of hold it in place. It's a little tilted. That's fine. I'm going to cut it and it's going to be straight to what it needs to be. But I'm just going to double check that it matches both of those points, and I show you how to do that in the pattern as well. And I'm going to trim one side and then flip it around and do the same thing on the other. If that seems a little confusing, don't worry. The pattern has great diagrams that you can use to follow along. I'm going to line up the ruler, that 4.5 inch line and the edge of the ruler with the trimmed edge, and then go along that side. And there I have my first trimmed half rectangle triangle. And don't worry, if you have to think through the first one a little bit, you'll have plenty more opportunities with this quilt. There's a lot of half rectangle triangles. So I'm going to trim this one up, and then I'll show you how we're going to piece it together to make the top section of our quilt. I have the first two half rectangle triangle blocks. Now I'm going to need another one to make the first column of my section. So I'm going to pull in one of those gray ones I cut, and I'm going to need the other half, and it's going to be this white color. This is why I like to cut them as I'm making them, that way I don't make a mistake. So it's pretty easy to see which way I need to cut this fabric so I can make my block. Set that one aside, sew these together, and trim them up the same way. To make this quilt as easy as possible to put together, I've designed it in sections, and then within each section I have columns, and those columns are going to go in between the panels. So I have the pieces to make the first column of my first section. So first I have my half rectangle triangle and some background fabric like that, so pretty. Next one, and then some more background fabric. So this is where we're starting to see the inspiration for this pattern come together. I think you're gonna start getting what I've got going on here. So what I'm gonna do is sew this together to make my first column. A quick press of the seams, and I have that first column. And when it goes next to my panels, it's gonna look really neat. Now, since there are a lot of sections and columns to this quilt, I got them all pieced, and to keep them organized, I just have them clipped together. I don't wanna get one piece mixed up with another section. So I know that this is all for my top. So what I'm gonna do is clear this off and show you what it looks like when it all comes together. Putting together the section is one of my favorite parts because that's when you really get to see it all come together. It's like if you're in the RV and you come over the hill and you see the beautiful mountains, it's almost as good as that feeling. So I have that first section that we saw, or that first column that we saw, and what's gonna happen is as I lay them out with my panels, we're gonna get this really neat kind of background effect, right? So I'm kind of envisioning the mountains behind it, creating the secondary pattern, and here is my next column. And as we continue that along the first section, we're gonna see all the beautiful panels and the background really come out. So there's that one. This is a big quilt, so it's not gonna quite fit on my table. If you have a design wall, that's gonna be really helpful to lay it out beforehand. But even if you don't have a huge design wall, it's still gonna work out because you're gonna put it together in sections and it'll help keep track of it. Then I'll have my next little panel over here, and then one more side bit. So what's nice is once I get to this point, all I have to do is start sewing them together in rows. So I'm going to do that and show you what the first section looks like. This first section is all together, and what's really nice about the columns is if your points aren't perfect, it'll be fine. It's going to just kind of look like it's going behind the panel. Now I'm going to add my top border and my second section. The half rectangle triangles in the second section were made the same way as the ones in the first section. They're just a little bit bigger, but the diagrams in the pattern will walk you through all of that. Well, now that I got the first three parts laid out, you can start to see those secondary patterns. I'm excited to see how it all comes together. So I'm going to get this sewn and show you what the bottom of the quilt looks like. So this quilt is finished, and on the top part of the quilt you can see our first section, our second section, and our top border. But as we make our way down the quilt, you'll see it's just repeated with different colors. So our second section has two panels and different fabric colors, but still that same half rectangle triangle technique. Beautiful. And as we make our way down to the bottom, you see not only that evergreen and the brown colors, and it just completes the whole quilt. I am super excited about how this looks. I can't wait to start quilting it. I'm thinking about using nature-inspired quilting designs. It's gonna be great. Well, let me get this basted so that we can get to the quilting. I'll see you in a bit. So I have my quilt sandwich basted and ready to go for the machine quilting. I spent a little time picking out some of my favorite thread colors. Now when it comes to quilting the panels of this quilt, sometimes it can be a little intimidating, but I'm going to show you how using a consistent texture over the whole thing will make it look lovely. So I'm going to start out with my lighter thread color, and we're going to start quilting some leaves in this yellow part. Once I fill in one section, I'm going to switch thread colors and move on to the next. Using this beautiful teal thread, I'm going to quilt a gentle back and forth design that goes quickly and gives the quilt a nice texture. So quilting all these different textures is going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait to switch thread colors and designs to give this a really nature-inspired look. Well, I'm going to get this finished up and then I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. Plus, I'll show you a thread painted example of a bigger panel. Well, I better get to it. See you in a minute. And this quilt is finished. I had a lot of fun adding some different texture with the quilting, but I want to show you how you can take it a little bit over the top if you want to. I've recently quilted these panels. They're the larger panels available from the National Parks collection, and this is what I would call thread painting. A lot of thread, a lot of detail added to it. And these are actually going to go on the wall, kind of like wall hangings. Now, I love all the detail it adds, but that's not going to be a very cuddly quilt. So for this quilt, I kept the quilting a little bit less dense, a little bit softer. I had so much fun playing with the panels, trimming them out, and then also just reminiscing about the whole experience of being at the national parks. Quilting a different design in each section really allowed me time to play with some different designs and thread colors while using the quilt as inspiration for the quilting designs. Continuing the designs through the panels themselves allows that beautiful texture to show without overwhelming the beautiful pictures on the panel. This is a great way to practice some of those all-over designs you've been wanting to learn. And it just so happens I'm going to be showing you how to quilt some of these in my next Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, Flora and Foliage. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. And if you want to get the kit or the pattern or any of the supplies you've seen here, you can find that on my website. But one lucky viewer is going to win the quilt kit for their very own. All you have to do is leave a comment below telling me which national park you would like to go to, and I'll pick a winner next week and announce it on social media. Well, I'm going to keep reminiscing about all my national parks trips that I've taken and ones that I'm planning. I'll be back next week with another episode of The Midnight Quilter. Until then, happy quilting.